Today marks the anniversary of the day my life changed forever, and it feels like no one else in the world remembers or cares, so I'm sharing this story with you. It all started when I was riding in the passenger seat with my brother and his best friend. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud explosion followed by a scream so raw and primal it could have come from a dying animal. It took me a moment to realize that the scream was coming from me. Then the searing pain in my head and left shoulder hit me. I couldn't move my arm and had no idea what had just happened, even though our car was still moving. Eventually, I forced my eyes open despite the glass shards that had embedded themselves in them. That's when I saw a massive hole in the windshield directly in front of me. I later learned that someone had dropped a huge rock from the bridge above onto the car we were in. If I hadn't been distracted by playing Pokemon Go and looking to the left, the rock would have hit me square on the head. Instead, it smashed into the left side of my skull and then ricocheted onto my shoulder. Once I understood what had happened, I numbly dialed 911, knowing I might only have minutes left to call my husband and say goodbye before my brain swelled and I died right there. I managed to call him, and he made me promise that I'd still dance in the rain with him someday. My brother pulled off the highway, and the ambulance met us at the exit. By then I was starting to convulse, which we initially thought was a seizure but turned out to be shock. I remember lying there, seeing the emergency lights flash and the car door open to reveal several MTs and state troopers. Behind them, I saw my husband's face, calm and loving. He's always been my rock, and he didn't want my last moments to be filled with panic. I smiled at him and focused all my energy on staying conscious and fighting the shock. I thought of my best friend who lived nearby, of the 10 years we'd spent together, and how everything had gone downhill because of his addiction. I thought of my parents. The EMTs were trying to figure out how to move me to the stretcher, but they couldn't put a neck brace on me because of the glass shards all over my neck. My neck didn't hurt, so I was fairly confident it wasn't broken. I stabilized my head, looked straight ahead, got up, and laid myself down on the stretcher because that was all we could do. My husband stood silently by as I reassured him everything was going to be fine. Those might have been my last words. When I got into the ambulance, a state trooper started photographing my horribly injured shoulder for the investigation. They hadn't caught the person who dropped the rock, and in the crime-ridden city I live in, they likely never would. After I was strapped in and ready to go, my husband got into the passenger seat of the ambulance and called my parents. My mum didn't answer. So he called my father, a man who wouldn't care if I were here or not. He picked up, and my husband handed me the phone through the small window. I told him what had happened, and he was just annoyed. "It's 11 at night, and we have to wake up early tomorrow. We can't talk to you now, and Mum's already in bed," he said. I told him there might not be a tomorrow and asked to speak to my mum. He angrily handed her the phone, and as she complained about it being late, I could hear him yelling at her in the background to hurry up. I told my mum what happened, but lied and reassured her that I was going to be fine. I told her I just wanted to send her pictures of the crime scene and my injuries. She complained that her phone was plugged in the bathroom and that she was already in bed. Eventually, I convinced her to look, and her reaction was as if I had told her I got a fish hook through my thumb. She then said, "Okay, I'm going to bed now. I have to be up early in the morning. Rest up." When we arrived at the ER, it was packed with patients. They didn't bother putting a mask on me before wheeling me, and I was going to die anyway, so it didn't really matter. I lay in that bed, feeling like my body had been run over, for 3 hours. No one washed the glass out of my eyes, and no one checked on me after the X-rays and CT scans. They refused to give me anything for the pain and finally showed up in the last hour with some Tylenol. I think I actually laughed. My husband stayed by my side, calmly talking to me the whole time. I realized in that moment that this was the summary of my life. My husband was the only one there as I lay in what I thought was my final hour, and I had never felt so completely alone. After the X-rays and CT scan, I called my best friend of 9 years, who lived 5 minutes from the hospital. I told him what had happened, and he freaked out, asking if I wanted him to come. How was I supposed to respond to that? I said, "If you want, you can." He was broke, so I told him we'd call him a lift. Another hour passed, and he never showed up. My husband texted him after that hour, and he replied that he was just getting into the shower. that hit me like a ton of bricks. Somehow the tests came back, and I hadn't broken anything or suffered any brain damage. No one could believe it, but I wasn't happy. All I had to show for it were massive bruises and soft tissue damage. Before this, I had suffered almost my entire life from suicidal ideation, debilitating PTSD from countless traumatic events, and a failed attempt, along with several other chronic disabilities, both psychiatric and physical. I was bitter that I had survived. I knew I'd have to live with what happened for the rest of my life, while to everyone else besides my husband and me, it was just a story they'd forget about in a few days, another messed up experience for me to relive over and over until the day I die. Yay! When I was discharged, I texted my best friend, telling him not to bother coming because I was going home. The next 2 weeks were spent lying in bed in the dark, mostly sleeping and crying for the few hours I was awake each day. I tried to bring attention to the assaults by creating a petition to get the city to put up nets or anything to prevent this from happening again. We were all playing Russian roulette, and there had been over 200 assaults like mine that summer. It was pointless. The petition went nowhere, and I was mocked by hundreds of strangers online. I left the house once to do a news interview after my post about the assault went viral on Facebook. I ended up being on the news twice and on the radio once for an interview. A stranger told me in a Facebook comment that he was tired of hearing about how all females have trauma and PTSD, and that I should stop self-diagnosing. I am very much professionally diagnosed. He said the problem was that I was soft and needed to get over it because nobody cares. My story was questioned repeatedly by people who doubted its validity. I was stopped on the street by locals who said it didn't look like my head was hit that hard. My story was invalidated over and over. My brother's girlfriend even asked me if I was sure I had actually been hit in the head and questioned why it affected me so much since all I got was just a bruise. I was told by hundreds of people how lucky I was that I didn't suffer permanent injuries or die, how I should be grateful. You know, out of millions of cars, mine had been targeted, and out of all the places the rock could have landed, it landed directly on my head. No one understands how infuriating it is to be told you're lucky after something like this happens. Nobody understands how insensitive it is to tell a survivor that they're lucky. And guess what? Because they mean well, all I get to do is swallow the hurt, thank them, and be told off for complaining about people trying to be nice. My husband, my high school sweetheart and legal caregiver who I've been with for half my life, stayed so strong for me for so long, which I feel terrible about. But after about 5 months, he couldn't hold it in anymore and absolutely broke down for a couple of weeks. He tried so hard not to make it about him, but he's messed up from it too. He drove so fast to meet the ambulance that night because he wanted to see me alive one last time. In the 2 weeks following, I ate a few pieces of meat during one of the days. That's literally it. 1 meal in 2 weeks. I felt that if I left that bed I wouldn't be safe, and since then, any time I leave, I fully expect to be suddenly, violently assaulted or killed. My alcoholic ex-best friend couldn't give me a good reason why he didn't bother showing up, but after what I found out about him, and how bad of a state he was really in before I cut him out of my life for good, I'm not shocked at all. That's a story for another time, but in case he reads this, F you, man, you're literally the worst best friend someone could ask for and a crappy, useless person. I'll add that many months later, he stayed at my house to help me as I was about to be hospitalized for my eating disorder and stole hundreds of dollars, grass, and alcohol from my husband and me to fuel his addiction. That was the last straw before I cut him out for good. My parents never called to ask if I was okay after that. A couple of months later, my mother freaked out because I wouldn't fly across the country with 1 day's notice to help her put down her dog, regardless of what I was going through, because she couldn't stomach it. I lost it when she made that call. I told her she hadn't bothered to come to my state when I was likely dying in the hospital, and that. It was ridiculous. She had the audacity to be mad at me for not being able to accommodate a $600 plane ticket to fly out the next day to have her dog put down when I was about to host guests. She assured me her and my father's reactions were my fault because I sounded so calm on the phone and played the situation down. We went no contact for months after that. It turns out she was diagnosed with a disease that affects her reasoning shortly after, so I guess I'm not even allowed to hold it against her, right? She eventually apologized for her behavior, and I let her back into my life. So after almost dying, I lost my best friend and parents for a while too. My brother has always had issues with empathy. When I told him after getting back home that I felt like the reality of what happened was going to hit me like a truck the next day, and that I'd be sad, he looked at me quizzically and said, "I don't understand why you'd be sad about it. If it were me, it wouldn't really affect me at all." There wasn't even anything I could say to that. There's no point in trying to explain what I was feeling to someone who couldn't possibly understand. I spent the next year with my eating disorder spiraling out of control, reliving the trauma of what happened over and over again. Every time something fell in the kitchen, I heard or saw glass breaking, or heard a loud, sudden noise. Every time I got into a car, every time I saw a car, every time I saw an overpass or drove under one, it took me months to be able to ride on the freeway again. Every time I leave my island to go to the city, on my way back, I have to drive right under the spot where I almost lost my life. There was no justice for this. The person who almost took my life was never caught. Life goes on, and I've lived every day alone in the hell that is my head, with my husband as my only support network. Don't even ask me about how therapy went. That's a whole other story I'm not going to get into. I look totally fine. I've got some scarring in the tissue on my shoulder that you can't see. I'm the image of a perfectly healthy, beautiful, lucky and happy woman. Today, I told my mum on the phone that I was sad because it was the anniversary of the day I almost had my life taken from me. She looked at me and said, "It's not an anniversary because it's not something worth remembering.